signal.
Yes.
Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagadgurum. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing class on Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Today we're going to continue discussing verses from chapter 6 of the Gita. I hope we'll be able to cover verses 18 to 23. That's the ambition for today. And because a number of you, especially online, but some of the in-person students too, had questions on the last assignment and on the last reading, which I couldn't get to in the last class, I want to address a few of them at the beginning of class. Then we're going to start on some of the new verses. And then with the remaining time, I want to address however many questions I can. And if you guys have questions as well. So that's the plan. Now, heads up in terms of future classes. Our next class will be on Sunday, June 29th, which is 2 weeks from now, at 9:30 a.m. And the assignment is, there's no actual study questions. The assignment is to read verses 6.24 to 28. So verses 24 to 28 of chapter 6 of the Gita. But here's the somewhat complicated thing. The July classes, okay, we're going to have, just as we had we're having 3 June classes, I'm adding 3 July classes, in part because I'm actually here on 3 weekends, which is rare. But secondly, because I don't want us to get too bogged down in chapter 6. It's a long chapter, and I want to make sure we're making steady progress on the Gita in general. Because it's literally we're just going on the one chapter from Sri Aurobindo's Essence on the Gita, because it covers the whole chapter 6. So I'm going to attempt to go through the entire chapter 6 by the end of July. That's the hope. Okay? So now, okay, so the next class is Sunday, June 29th, 9:30 a.m. No homework assignment, except to read the verses 24 to 28 of chapter 6. But the 3 July classes are the following. Sunday, July 6th, 9:30 a.m. Sunday, July 13th, 9:30 a.m. And Sunday, July 27th at 9:30 a.m. So 3 July classes, July 6th, July 13th, July 27th. And for the July 6th class at 9:30 a.m., there are going to be study questions based on verses 29 to 32 of chapter 6. Very famous verses about how you see the self in all and you act accordingly. So I want to give you guys ample time. And that's why I'm giving you 3 weeks to do, and I'm going to announce the study questions today. And I'll post so that you have access to them ahead of time. So I'm giving you plenty of time in advance, 3 weeks to do these study questions. But it's not for the next class, which is June 29th, but for the next to next class. 2 classes from now, Sunday, July 6th, 9:30 a.m. That's what the study questions are for. And so you have to submit them by July 5th, day before. Any questions about that? Great. Perfect. Okay. And just to mention, for those online, if you're not aware, I have a Sunday talk after this at 11 a.m. on Sri Ramakrishna and Sri Aurobindo. So for anybody who's been following the Gita class, the talk should be quite interesting and relevant and thought-provoking, I hope. And happy Father's Day. Okay. Let's begin. Let's start with some questions that you guys had from the last class. Okay. Here we go. I'll just go through a couple first and then... Okay, Kiran. At the end of the chapter that we were discussing, Sri Aurobindo says, "It is this that is the closing word." What does he refer to when he says the highest spiritual mystery and the divine secret? Okay, so she's referring to this is the chapter called Nirvana and Works in the World, the one we've already read. And I'm going to read you the last few lines. Page 246 of Essays on the Gita. Sri Aurobindo writes, "But even among yogins, the greatest is the bhakta." Quote, and he's quoting 6.47, the very last verse of chapter 6. It's very significant. "Of all yogins, he who with all his inner self given up to me," Krishna, for me has love and faith, Shraddhavan bhajate, him I hold to be the most united with me in yoga. It is this that is the closing word of these first 6 chapters and contains in itself the seed of the rest, of that which still remains unspoken and is nowhere entirely spoken. For it is always and remains something of a mystery and a secret, rahasyam, the highest spiritual mystery and the divine secret. So what is this great mystery? I think it's, I don't want to be too glib about this and say that I know for sure, but I think, in light of having read the entire essay on the Gita, I think the secret, well, do you guys have thoughts about this? What do you think the highest spiritual mystery and divine secret might be before I make my suggestion? Any guesses? Okay. I think is the Purushottama idea from chapter 15. That's only explicitly introduced in chapter 15. And I think until then, he keeps giving these hints. This is the thing that the Gita is kind of gesturing toward. How is it that bhakti is higher than anything else? There's no way to justify it until you have the Purushottama concept, which is introduced only in chapter 15, 9 chapters later. Do you see what I mean? So it's kind of like he's reading a lot of these verses, especially like the last verse of chapter 6, when it talks about bhakti being higher than everything else, as hinting at, adumbrating this idea of the Purushottama. Okay. What is the Purushottama again? The impersonal, personal, infinite divine. Okay? Okay. Vikas asks a very interesting and politically fraught question. And he says, in class, we talked about samadrishti toward everyone, friend or foe, a spiritual vision of equanimity, right? We talked about that last time. Without entering into political specifics, I want to ask from an adhyatmika perspective, a spiritual perspective. Given current events like the India-Pakistan conflict, the Pahalgam massacre that happened recently, and then the Indian retaliation or response, which is called Operation Sindoor, and then the violence between the two countries. Okay, given current events like the India-Pakistan conflict, where I personally feel aligned with India's stance on non-tolerance towards terrorism, how can one maintain samadrishti while still upholding a sense of justice/dharma? Now, first of all, before I finish this question, I wanted to let me finish the question. At the end of the day, it is human beings who are suffering and dying, and he mentions the problem of evil. But some people even invoke the Gita to justify war. What would a truly adhyatmika outlook look like in such a situation where the realities of violence, national identity, especially living outside of India, Vikas, I believe, is from London, and ethical action intersect? If you aren't happy to answer this publicly, I wouldn't mind if you emailed me in response personally, but just something that has been bothering me. So thank you for your consideration. Here's the reason why I think it's an important question in the context of this class. There are a few reasons, but number one is because the Gita's explicit subject is war, a just war. And so it's a very relevant question. Secondly, because Sri Aurobindo, in his time, early 20th century, first of all, he was a freedom fighter before he took to spiritual life. And it was very close to his heart, this, fighting for India's freedom from the British. And thirdly, because he was contemporaneous with Gandhiji, and they had, in some respects, diametrically opposing stances on this issue that Vikas is asking. And he was often asked about what he thought about Gandhi's policies, about satyagraha, nonviolence, and this and that. And I want to read to you his response, because I think it's pretty much a direct response to Vikas's question. Sri Aurobindo says, and he's speaking in the third person, but he wrote this. He says, there seems to be put forth here and in several places the idea that Sri Aurobindo's political standpoint was entirely pacifist, that he was opposed in principle and in practice to all violence, and that he denounced terrorism, insurrection, etc. as entirely forbidden by the spirit and letter of the Hindu religion. It is even suggested that he was a forerunner of Mahatma Gandhi and his gospel of ahimsa, non-injury. This is quite incorrect, and if left, would give a wrong idea about Sri Aurobindo. He has given his ideas on the subject generally in the Essays on the Gita, first series. If you remember long back, he specifically mentioned, without mentioning Gandhi by name, I think, but he mentioned Gandhi's ideas, where he supports the Gita's idea of dharmya yuddha, a just war, and criticizes, though not expressly, the Gandhian ideas of soul force. Okay. Soul force without physical violence, without any resort to physical violence. If he had held the pacifist ideal, meaning Sri Aurobindo now, he would never have supported the Allies or anybody else in this war he's now talking about World War One, I believe. Or was it? Yeah, probably. It depends on the. I think it might actually be World War Two because he was writing later. No? Anyway. Still less sanctioned some of his disciples joining the army as airmen, soldiers, doctors, electricians, etc. The declarations and professions quoted in the book are not his. That's okay. So, let's see. Okay. Then he says, I'm skipping something. He says, peace is part of the highest ideal, but it must be spiritual or at the very least psychological in its basis. Without a change in human nature, it cannot come with any finality. If it is attempted on any other basis, mental principle or gospel of ahimsa or any other, so he's thinking of Gandhi again, it will fail and even may leave things worse than before. Okay, so this is his, I hope you get the overall gist of this, right? I think that Sri Aurobindo's view is that, of course, he supports peace, but ultimately you can't have peace in the world without inner peace, which requires spiritual transformation. This is something that Peace Pilgrim strongly emphasized. I gave a talk in Trabuco on last Sunday. And she called herself Peace Pilgrim, but one of her main things was she was not a traditional peace activist in that way. Of course, she didn't want violence, but she recognized that to have true nonviolence in the world, you have to find inner peace. The only way to do that is through spiritual practice. So she was a wandering sannyasini that was literally walked all over the U.S. in support of peace, but advocating ultimately for an inner peace, which addresses the root of the problem of violence. Until we arrive at universal inner peace, violence is going to be, arguably, Sri Aurobindo says, realistically, a necessity in this world order. And he thinks that there are cases where not responding with violence could be more destructive in the future, in the end. And look, I don't want to get into political specifics here, and you can decide for yourself, but my own leanings are toward Sri Aurobindo rather than toward Gandhiji. And it might be people who are scholars of Gandhi might feel that this is not an accurate representation of Gandhiji's own views. Feel free to make comments in the YouTube section, as long as try to keep them respectful. Okay, so any questions or comments about that? Okay, good. So I suggest that we now move on to some of the new verses, and then I'll try to come back to some of the other questions that some of you had. So let's open our apps, and we're starting on verse 18 of chapter 6. And so the basic idea is, in our current world situation, at our current level of consciousness, sometimes if you're always observing nonviolence, what happens is your violent enemies will take advantage of it, and they'll be very happy. They'll be thrilled that you're never going to respond with violence, because then they'll just trample all over you, right? So that's the concern, which Sri Aurobindo seem to be aware of. What?
Just like what happened to Buddhism.
It's what happened to Buddhism. What do you mean by that?
Well, Afghanistan Buddhists were all peaceful and they were overrun.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting, and you can come up with other examples as well. But if you're always practicing nonviolence, your enemy may take advantage of that, right? Exploit that as a weakness to beat you over the head with. Okay, so verse 18. Please repeat after me. Yada viniyatam chittam atmani eva avatisthate nispriyah sarvakamebhyo yukta iti uchyate tada. Good. Okay, so now we're getting into the heart of this meditative, starting with this verse, we get into the heart of this meditative practice, which is the core of chapter 6. What is this practice of meditation that Krishna is recommending that we engage in? In this chapter, he's saying, yada, when, viniyatam chittam, when the controlled mind, sarvakamebhyaha nispriyaha. Okay, this is a little tricky in terms of the Sanskrit and meaning, and there are different interpretations, because the word kama is used. What does kama usually mean? Desire. Sensuous desire, if you will. Yes, lust, often, specifically lust, sexual desire, but it could also just mean sense desires in general, desires for sense pleasures. Sarvakamibhya. So that is a primary meaning in general, but some commentators, like Shankara even, he takes kama in this context and in several other verses to mean an object of desire rather than as. And the question is why? Well, because the next word is nispriyaha. That literally means being free from desire or hankering or craving. And what are you free from desire for? What is the object of that hankering or desire? Kama. Sarva kamebhya nispriyaha. Because grammatically speaking, sarva kamebhya, it's in the case where it's going with this nispriyaha. So having no desire for kama. That's the expression. So Shankara says having no desire for desire sounds too paradoxical. So he goes for having no desire for objects of desire. And he understands. So this is why I wrote on the board 6.18 kama. Is it desire or is it an object of desire? Shankara goes for object of desire. He just thinks that's an easier way to explain the meaning of this. Sri Aurobindo doesn't give a straight translation here, I think. He sometimes does, actually. Like in chapter 2, toward the very end, there's a beautiful, one of my favorite verses, very poetic. It's 2.70. Apuryamanam achala pratishtham samudramapah pravishanti yadvat tadvat kamayam pravishanti sarve sashantim apnoti na kamakami. So be like a vast infinite ocean in which these little rivulets of desire enter, but they don't affect you in any way. Don't be like a kamakami. Kamakami, notice the paradox here. Kamakami, a kami is somebody who is desirous of what? Of kama. Somebody who has kama for kama. And Sri Aurobindo, in this context, he embraces the paradox in a way. And he's saying, you shouldn't desire desires. You shouldn't identify with the desires in that kind of sense. And I think that's a more spiritually and psychologically profound understanding than maybe Shankara's. Shankara's is fine, and it could also be true. And I think it's possible that both, one can interpret kama as object of desire and as desire. But I think that the richer psychological and spiritual meaning comes from understanding kama as desire itself, because I think it relates especially in contemporary times to mindfulness practice, which has become a hot spiritual practice these days. Even in psychology, in therapy, it's one of the main practices now. It's called, it's a part of cognitive behavioral therapy, and especially one subset of that, which is called dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT. Developed by a woman named Marsha Linehan in the 1970s. She suffered from borderline personality disorder herself. And she met a Zen Buddhist monk, I believe, who introduced her to mindfulness practices. And it completely changed her life. And she developed dialectical behavioral therapy on the basis of this Zen Buddhist kind of framework. And it's been empirically proven to help a lot of patients, especially with borderline personality disorder, but also with other kinds of psychological disorders and issues. Now, what I'm suggesting is that Vedanta prescribes a different kind of mindfulness practice that shares the advantages of Buddhist mindfulness, but has a certain uniqueness and advantage that Buddhism arguably lacks, depending on what your spiritual temperament is. So Buddhist mindfulness is based on the metaphysical doctrine of no self, anatta in Pali, anatma. We have no enduring self. There's no permanent or eternal self at all. There's no such thing as a higher self. This is at least one mainstream understanding of Buddhism. Of course, there are different sub-schools, and some of those sub-schools and later sects of Buddhism, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, lean closer to an Advaita Vedanta kind of view. It gets complicated. But Theravada Buddhism, for instance, and then the schools I'm talking about now, they're based on a no-self doctrine. So what does that mean for mindfulness practice? Well, it means when an unwholesome thought or desire arises in the mind, take a step back from it. Be non-judgmentally aware of that thought or feeling or desire. Non-judgmental awareness is crucial to mindfulness. It's like, so self-forgiveness is a really important part of mindfulness practice in general. But how is this related to the no-self doctrine? The idea is I'm not these desires, I'm not these feelings, but because I am not. I mean, in a certain radical sense. There's no I. There's no enduring I at the end of the day. That's the Buddhist idea. You deconstruct the I completely. Okay. Vedantic mindfulness, I think, is what's being suggested in verses like 6.18. Nispriha sarvakamebhyo. Kama arises in your mind. Some desire for some kind of sense object, for instance, or something worldly. The practice is, as a Vedantic mindfulness practitioner, is to take a step back from that desire as it arises in the mind. Practice non-judgmental awareness of it. But instead of saying, I'm not this desire because I'm no self, you say, I'm not this desire because I'm the higher self. Right? Non-judgmental awareness of negative desires or thoughts in the mind, kama, by taking a step back from them through identification with the higher spiritual Atman. Why do I think this is advantageous for at least some spiritual aspirants? Well, because it's a very positive practice. It's grounded in a positive identification with our true essential nature, our deeper self, which is free from all desires. It's eternally blissful, eternally desireless, and eternally liberated, right? So it's a tremendous source of kind of strength. This is why Swami Vivekananda, one of the keynotes of all of his talks and writings was, it's a standing libel upon human nature to call a man a sinner, right? We are children of immortal bliss. Yeah.
But you really have to have a sense of separation from body consciousness. I mean, you have to be separate from your motivational connection to the senses, even as well as sense objects. But you have to be removed from, or have a sense of being removed from them.
So that's the practice, right? And it doesn't happen overnight, and it's very difficult. And so that's the whole point of all these different spiritual practices. But at least when a few, like once or twice a day, when you're sitting for meditation, Swami Vivekananda, he says that meditation, why is it so important? Because at least in that time of day, for those, however much time you can devote to it, whether it's 5 minutes or 2 hours, there's not the slightest touch of the material. You shut your eyes, shut yourself to the world. And that's why that's the idea behind chapter 6, I think, is that it's not meant to be practiced all day. But even in the midst of the world, all of your worldly activities, you've got a family, right? This is not just meant for sannyasis and monks. It's meant for everybody. But even householders should take, at least 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Sit down, shut your eyes, sit in, cross-legged posture, and try to engage in some form of meditative practice, right? And in those, if you can succeed in even 1 minute or 30 seconds to begin with, that's a good start. And then you try to deepen that meditative practice. And then ideally what happens is the meditative practice will percolate into your day-to-day life outside of meditation. That's the basic idea. And then it should ultimately become natural and spontaneous. And then even when you're, arguing with your coworkers or with your employees or with your spouse or with your, whatever it is, but that mindfulness will still be present in the background. You know what I mean? That's how I see it. Yeah, it's not easy, but spiritual life is like walking on the edge of a razor blade, right? Okay. Okay, I think that's the only other thing I wanted to mention is that this whole chapter, as I mentioned before, and as Sri Aurobindo notes, has deep affinities with Patanjali's yoga philosophy. Okay, as articulated in the Yoga Sutras, which I'm teaching in a separate class, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. It's an ongoing class. You can catch up by going to my website. Now, 1.2, Sutra 1.2 of the Yoga Sutras defines yoga as Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Chitta Vritti Nirodha. The total elimination or cessation of all mental fluctuations or thought waves. Okay, Chitta Vrittis. And at the same time, what's the purpose of that? In order to identify with our deeper spiritual nature as the Purusha. That's the term used in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Each of us is an eternal Purusha, which is eternally liberated and which is separate from the body-mind complex. And this first line in verse 18, Yada Vinyatam Chittam Atmani Eva Avatishtate. Okay, so now let's get back to the Anvaya and I'll explain this. So, Atmani Eva Avatishtate. So, you take a step back from the unwholesome thoughts and desires in the mind and identify with your higher self. So that's this Atmani Eva Avatishtate. Always take He says we must take a very high stand. Swami Vivekananda used to say, we must always identify with the Atman, the higher Atman. So this is what the verse is saying. Tada, when you do that, yukta ituchyate, then you can truly be said to be yukta. The term yukta is used in yoga. And remember this, we had the discussion last time about what the term yukta might mean in the previous verse, for instance, yukta ahara, and traditional commentators tended to take yukta to just mean moderate. And here, yukta is clearly being defined in a much more lofty spiritual sense, right? And so some commentators like Sri Aurobindo suggest that we should read that loftier spiritual sense of yukta into the preceding verse as well, 6.17. Okay. And that loftier sense is you should always be united with and conscious of and mindful of the divine, your higher self. Okay. Now, 19. Please repeat after me. Yatha dipo nivatastho Nengate Sopama Smrita Yogino Yatachittasya Yunjato Yogamatmanaha Yatha Nivat. This is a very famous verse with a beautiful metaphor, which is often quoted, one of the greatest hits from the Gita. Yatha Nivatastaha Deepaha. Just as a deepa, a flame or a light in a lamp, nivatasta, completely still. When we think of a flame, even the slightest bit of wind will make it flicker, right? This is, you have to imagine a situation where this flame is completely still. In kind of ideal conditions, right? Na ingate atma, so it's completely still. Na ingate, there's absolutely no even a flicker, the slightest flicker. Atmanaha yogam yunjataha. Here there's a slight difference in commentators about what atmanaha yogam. Yogam is yoga, but atmanaha. This is in the sixth case, I believe. So one can take liberties a little bit grammatically of the meaning of this, with the meaning of this phrase atmanaha yogam. Atmanaha yoga. It could be yoga with the Atman, which would mean something like union with the higher self. Shankara will go for more of a Patanjalian kind of reading, and he says that yogam here should mean samadhi, in the sense of concentration. Patanjali also defines yoga as concentration and samadhi rather than as union. Okay, Sri Aurobindo goes for the union. Tapasyananda goes for union as well, by the way, in this book. Ramanuja goes in a different direction from either of those, saying Atmanaha yoga means yoga concerning the Atman, like relating to the Atman. So there are different ways of you can interpret this creatively because of the grammar is a little bit open-ended here. And I don't want to take a strong stand on it, but Ramanuja, how will he interpret this verse? As usual, he thinks all of chapter 6 is a description of Jnana Yoga. Not in Shankara's sense. This is in his own bhakti framework. Jnana Yoga is meditation on your true eternal nature as a jiva, an individual soul separate from the body-mind complex. Okay? And each of us has a distinct jiva. This relates to a question that Padma had, so I can address it now. Her question is, can you remind us again or explain again how different commentators understand the word Atma or self? With the lowercase s and with the capital S. Okay, the thing is, I can't make generalizations about it because even a single commentator may differ in their interpretation of the word Atman from verse to verse. It depends on the context of the verse, and so it's actually quite complicated. It's a very good question, but we'd have to go through verse by verse. Here, for instance, Ramanuja will take Atman to mean the Jivatma. And in many cases, in these early chapters, Ramanuja's, like in chapter 2, for instance, he means the Jivatma. And he says that it's essential to realize yourself as the eternal Jivatman, individual soul separate from the body-mind complex. Okay. Consistently, Sri Aurobindo takes this Atman in these early chapters to refer to the non-dual self with a capital S. Not as a Jivatman, but as the higher non-dual self, the highest non-dual self. Okay. So it's non-dual for him. And this is one of those few areas where he agrees with Shankara, because Shankara also takes the Atman in general here to mean the non-dual self, the highest truth. But there are obvious differences between Shankara and Sri Aurobindo, as I'll talk about in my talk, but as we should all be experts in by now, because Shankara says, He denies the ultimate reality of the personal God, Shakti, whereas Sri Aurobindo accepts it as an aspect of the Purushottama, the dynamic aspect of the same infinite Purushottama. And instead of dismissing this world as an illusion or as ultimately non-existent, Sri Aurobindo's view and his interpretation of the Gita, and really you should decide for yourselves, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to find verses in the Gita that directly support Shankara's view that this world is unreal. The Gita is full of verses that say that this world is impermanent, not eternal. But saying that it's mithya, that it's an illusion, that it's an illusory appearance, I can't think of a single verse that supports that. But again, there's at least one online person, I think his name is Shubho, who will jump to Shankara's rescue here. So please feel free. Okay. So anyway, that's a big question. I only started to answer it, but I hope I at least started to address it. Now, let's keep doing the parsing of the words here. So Atmanaha Yogam, I explained Yunjata. So engaging in this yogam with the Atman. Yata Chittasya Yoginaha, that yogis who have Yata Chittasya, a restrained or controlled or regulated mind. Sa Upama Smrita. So the yogi who is constantly identified with his higher Atman, self, the best analogy to use is the unflickering flame. Like the mind of that yogi, that perfectly controlled mind of that yogi. So again, going back to Patanjali's idea of yoga as chitta vritti nirodha, total elimination of all mental fluctuations, all thought waves. The metaphor here used is of a completely unflickering lamp. Okay. Now, I think there's an interesting question here, which is, even though this verse uses the idea of a lamp or a light as a metaphor for the accomplished or realized yogi's mind, the state of his mind, right? It's like an unflickering lamp. Or it's an analogy, a metaphor, because it actually explicitly says like, yatha. Okay. The question is, or I think it's interesting, I think one can also interpret this verse as suggesting light as an object of meditation. And it's not just as a metaphor, but you can also meditate on light as your higher self, for instance.
What is the term that Patanjali uses? Alambana?
Alambana, yeah, as a support, yeah, as a meditative support. You can think of the Purusha within the yoga philosophy, it's called Purusha. You can think of the Purusha as a light, as an effulgent light within the heart, right, between the eyebrows, whatever you want to do. This is a common practice, and in fact, Atma Jyoti is a common expression in Vedantic scriptures. Atma Jyoti, the light of the Atman, capital L, capital A. And Sri Ramakrishna, he often encourages this, and he says, when your consciousness is elevated from the three lower centers, organ of evacuation, generation, and the navel, up to the heart center, what happens? He describes it very precisely in the gospel as Jyoti Darshan Hoy. Jyoti means light. He says you have a vision of light. And he says even more specifically, Jivatma Shikarne Darshan Hoy. Jivatma Shikarne. That person realizes the Jivatma. He uses that exact term, the term that Ramanuja uses. You realize the Jivatman in the shape of a flame. Shikarne. Shikarnyaya. In Bengali, it's like very Sanskritic. So Shika is a flame. You perceive a light, and then he says, you realize the Jivatman in the shape of a flame. And then he says, Shadak bole eki. And the sadhaka says, what is this? It's a wondrous realization, to realize yourself. And we poo-poo it because we're conditioned by Shankara and we think that the Jivatma is a lower reality. And we have to go beyond duality and the individual self is a very low reality. Yeah.
But does he actually recommend meditating on light?
Who's the he?
Sri Ramakrishna.
Sometimes he does. And he says that's one example of a nirakara dhyana, which means a meditation on the formless. And he says any object of meditation that helps you to concentrate the mind is good, actually. I see. So you're saying that's the realization. So is that actually? I think one can also use that as a practice, and it's one that's strongly supported by scriptures like the Upanishads, sometimes in the Gita also. And
that can only happen until you make that realization of the preparation of the
No. Well, that's so Sri Ramakrishna is describing a realization. He's quite, and so what I'm suggesting is we can also do it as a practice. even though Sri Ramakrishna was not explicit in that context about being a practice, but I think we can take it as a practice. And we can always take Shankara's useful remark on the Sthita Prajna Lakshana from chapter 2, which described the characteristics of a realized soul. And Shankara says, whatever those characteristics of a realized soul are, which come naturally to the realized soul, the sadhaka can and should practice as a spiritual aspirant. So I think the same thing can be said about Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. Right? If the realized soul realizes the Jivatman in the shape of a flame, why can't we imaginatively meditate on the Jivatman in the shape of a flame as a practice? That's how I see it. Yeah? Very good. Okay. Now, why don't we move on to verse 20? Yatro paramate chittam niruddham yoga sevaya yatra chaivatmanatmanam pashan atmani tushyati. Okay. Sri Aurobindo kind of takes this verse, in most commentators they take it to go with the subsequent verses, but I'm going to read it separately for now. Yatra yoga sevaya, that which yoga sevaya, through the practice of yoga, niruddham chittam uparamate, the controlled mind goes completely silent. It's completely withdrawn. Yatra cha atmana atmani atmanam. There's a play on the word atman. So Padma's question comes back again. So when you are faced in the same verse with the word atman used multiple times, there's this tricky question of how to interpret the word atman. And some will go for the safe, I call it safe, I'm not criticizing it, but the safe way is to say that you give different meanings to the word atman within the same verse, so that like you can refer to one Atman as the higher mind, and then the other Atman as the spiritual self, and then so that there's a way to distinguish the meaning. And then other commentators will take it all to mean each instance of Atman to mean the self, the higher self, which is more interesting but also a little bit paradoxical sounding. So Sri Aurobindo will take that route. Okay. So, and it's like Atman in different cases. This is grammatical cases. So Atmana, by the Atman, this is the instrumental case, the third case in Sanskrit. Atmani, in the Atman. Atmanam, second case, as a direct object. So it's like realizing the self, by the self, in the self, like kind of a thing. And Sri Aurobindo is happy with that and says that this is a kind of using words to explain a spiritual realization. And by contrast, Swami Tapasyananda, just to give you an example, this is 6.20. He goes for the following. He says, sounds like a laptop's going to explode. You're fine? It's like a hyperdrive or something. Okay. He says, that state in which the chitta, mind stuff, with its movements restrained by the practice of yoga, finds rest, in which is experienced the joy of the spirit born of the higher mind, intuiting the spirit. So he's rendering the by the self as by the higher mind, intuiting the spirit with the capital S, the spiritual Atman. Okay. And that's a perfectly valid interpretation, and that could be true. Sri Aurobindo goes the route of saying, I'm wondering, let's actually read sometimes this book that I'm using where it kind of quotes, oh my goodness, my book is falling apart, sorry. Because it's old and I read it so much. Thank you. Okay, but I'm going to read you page 242 from the chapter that we're discussing, because I think it's actually clear, the context here. So this is his explanation of the verse. He says, this piece of nirvana is reached when all the mental consciousness is perfectly controlled and liberated from desire and remains still in the self. When motionless like the light of a lamp in a windless place, 6.19, right? It ceases from its restless action, shut in from its outward motion, and by the silence and stillness of the mind, the self is seen within. So now he's explaining 6.20. Not disfigured as in the mind. So he's explicitly distinguishing it from a realization at the mental level. Not disfigured as in the mind, but in the self, capital S. Seen not as it is mistranslated falsely or partially by the mind and represented to us through the ego, but self-perceived by the self, capital S again, svaprakasha. So it's a self-illumination, and he's saying this is not, don't think that there's subject-object duality here. We might think perceiving the self by the self, the non-dualist will say, that's dualistic again. And he's saying it's not non-dual, it's a swaprakasha, that's a Sanskrit term for a self-illumination, self-perception by the self, but in a non-dual manner. Okay, so like the self shining forth. All this paradoxical language is kind of, it's straining the limits of language to explain a spiritual experience. I think that's part of why we're coming up against the limits of language.
I don't think it's straining. I mean, to most people, but if you see it musically,
right.
An A is an A that has different vibratos, and any note is influenced by the notes around it. So the self is influenced by what's around it at the given moment. So it can have different meanings depending on context. It's all a vibration.
Yeah.
But to me, it's completely cohesive.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think people who are the more artistic temperament, poetic temperament, they can more readily relate to these kinds of metaphors and apparent paradoxes. Upanishads are full of these kinds of paradoxes. Bhagavad Gita is also full of these paradoxes, and it's written in poetry. And it's one of the things that Sri Aurobindo points out. He has this beautiful essay on the Upanishads and their importance and their value, and he says that they are at once the highest poetry, the highest philosophy, and a record of the highest spiritual experiences, right? And he says it's characteristic of the Indian mind that the highest spiritual teachings are put in the form of poetry, right? That's very, very important. The Bible wasn't written as poetry. Some of the Psalms are and all that, but imagine entire scripture written in poetry. All the Upanishads are like that, or most of them. And the Gita, the whole thing is a poem. It's a long poem. It's a song of God, Bhagavad Gita. Also, just to bring it back to Sri Ramakrishna again, I think Sri Aurobindo is interpreting this whole chapter as kind of conveying the jnana stage that Sri Ramakrishna talks about, reaching the roof by leaving the steps behind one by one and realizing yourself as a non-dual self, capital S, separate from the body-mind complex. But ultimately, this is just a prelude to the even greater stage of vijnana, which comes up in the subsequent chapters. You see, again, Sri Aurobindo is trying to honor the development of thought of the Gita itself across 18 chapters. We're only at chapter 6 now. Bhakti becomes the keynote starting soon, but just not yet. Even though there are hints, the very last verse in chapter 6, again, suddenly Krishna busts out with, but bhakti is greater than everything else. But we don't have the philosophical framework to understand or justify that yet, right? That's what Sri Aurobindo seems to be saying. It's hinted at. And there's a rhetorical and literary, I think, rationale for that. It's a beautiful literary work. T.S. Eliot ranked it as, he's a Westerner, this is the greatest philosophical poem in any language after Dante's Divine Comedy, or the Inferno, I think. Okay, so let's continue to parse this. Okay, so atmana, atmani, atmanam. The perception of the self, in the self, by the self. But it's beautiful. Pashyan eva tushyati. And you should be content in that self. Yat atyantikam sukham. Okay, okay. Do you see how, if you guys are using the app, there's this massive paragraph because it's explaining, it's treating 20, 21, and 22 all as grammatically part of one giant sentence, basically. Okay, so it's a little bit hard to kind of follow, but I suggest that we move on to verse 21. And we'll read 21 and 22 together, and then we'll talk about the rest of them. Okay, so verse 21. Sukham atyantikam yattat buddhigrahyam atindriyam veti yatra nachaivayam sthitaha chalati tatvataha. 22. Yam labdva chaparam labham manyate nadhikantataha yasmin stito na dukkena gurunapi vichalyate. Okay, these are some very beautiful poetic verses. Okay. Yat atyantikam sukham. Sukham, as most of you probably know, means bliss or happiness, joy. Atyantikam. It's like the highest possible bliss. There's nothing higher. That's what atyantikam means. Like, what would be the English? Like, awesome. But even awesome might have something more than that, right? But so what would be like the awesomest of the awesome? Okay, that kind of bliss. Sukhamatyantikam yattat buddhi grahyam. What? And then it uses other adjectives to explain this highest bliss. Buddhi grahyam. This is interesting. Buddhi grahyam. It is graspable by the buddhi. Right? And we already saw Sri Aurobindo's kind of saying it can't be grasped by the mind, this kind of highest self. And this comes up in the gospel explicitly. Right? Because some pandit comes and quotes the scriptures like Taittiriya Upanishad, which says, Yato vacho nivattante apra apya manasa saha. The highest Brahman is beyond the reach of words, beyond the reach of the mind, right? And Sri Ramakrishna says, Kintu shuddha buddhir gochor, which means, but the Atman is shuddha buddhi gochor. It is accessible to or graspable by the shuddha buddhi, the pure buddhi. And one of his famous teachings is, the shuddha manas, the shuddha mind, and the shuddha buddhi, and the shuddha Atman are one and the same, he says, ak, in Bengali. So what did he mean by that? He seems to be saying that when you can completely purify the higher mind and the lower mind, the Atman will shine forth. You don't have to do anything else. And I think one can interpret this buddhi grahyam. So how can this highest bliss be grasped by the buddhi? Because it's this totally purified buddhi that Sri Ramakrishna is talking about. Okay. Atindriyam. It's beyond the senses. Veti yatra nachevayam. How does it parse this? Atindriyam tat veti. So that person who knows that. Yatra chastitaha ayam tatvataha nachalati. Once that person is established in that highest bliss, what happens? It can no longer fall away from the spiritual truth of its being. So Leela was talking about how, you try to identify with the higher self and then immediately you're distracted by something worldly and this and that. So this is an ideal condition where once you realize this highest bliss of the Atman, you can't deviate from that anymore. Yeah. It's a permanent state. It's undeviating. It's an undeviating awareness of your true nature as the non-dual self. That's Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. And now, the gloss on 22. Okay, now. Evam yam labham labdha. Once you have attained this highest of all attainments, spiritual attainments, tatha adhikam aparam na manyate. And it's so high that you realize when you attain that state, there's nothing, you say, there's just spontaneous, you feel there's nothing greater than this. Sri Ramakrishna, he'll give the example of, he says that in spiritual experience, there are always these, every time you think that you've reached the highest, you're going to find that there's something higher than that. And he gives the example of you go into a forest and you see these amazing gems, like let's say there's like a silver mines or something, and you become rich and you get very excited. But then you walk even further and you say, oh my goodness, they're gold and it's even more valuable than silver. And you go further and you see diamonds and it's like so. But finally, when you reach the end, you don't have to ask anymore whether there's something beyond it. You know that you've reached the limit. Okay, so this is the absolute limit. And where you know in your heart of hearts that there's nothing beyond this. Tataha adhikam aparam na manyate. There's nothing higher than this bliss. Yasmin sthitaha, this is really important from a psychological standpoint, I think. Yasmin sthitaha cha guruna dukkhena api na vichalyate. That person in that state of highest realization, because he is stationed in the higher self at all times, he is not shaken even by guruna dukkhena, even by the worst possible suffering and grief, depression, the heaviest affliction or grief.
What state is this? Is this jnana, vijnana?
Even the jnani can have this actually, yeah, because we're not at the vijnana level yet.
But if it's the highest possible, isn't
that's interesting. So you're saying, well, it's not sure what to say about that. Let's see what Sri Aurobindo says about it. Let me continue reading the paragraph. He says, then the soul is satisfied and knows its own true and exceeding bliss. Not that untranquil happiness which is the portion of the mind and the senses, but an inner and serene felicity in which it is safe from the mind's perturbations and can no longer fall away from the spiritual truth of its being. Not even the, and now he's explaining 22, not even the fieriest assault of mental grief can disturb it. For mental grief comes to us from outside, is a reaction to external touches, and this is the inner, the self-existent happiness of those who no longer accept the slavery of the unstable mental reactions to external touches. Does he even render this na adhikam? Well, it says its own true and exceeding bliss. That's the authenticum. I'm trying to see if he directly renders this. Aparam labham manyate na adhikam tataha. The person, Anirban Roy, in his edition, he renders it as, that is the greatest of all gains and the treasure beside which all lose their value. But does he say that in the actual essays on the Gita? I don't see that exactly. Oh, he says it kind of later. This is one of the issues with Sri Aurobindo's commentary, is that sometimes he'll do callbacks. He'll go back to a previous verse later. So let me keep reading. But actually, he's referring to verse 23 as well, which we haven't read yet. But let me just keep reading so that we have it in our mind. He says, it is the putting away of the contact with pain, the divorce of the mind's marriage with grief, dukkha sanyoga viyogam. This is 23. We're about to get to that. The firm winning of this inalienable spiritual bliss is yoga. It is the divine union. It is the greatest of all gains and the treasure beside which all others lose their value. Therefore is this yoga to be resolutely practiced without yielding to any discouragement by difficulty or failure until the release, until the bliss of nirvana is secured as an eternal possession. So, this phrase, it is the greatest of all gains and the treasure beside which all others lose their value. That's how I think Sri Aurobindo renders this phrase. Manyate nadikam tada. There's nothing greater than that. So, it is the greatest of all gains and the treasure beside which all others lose their value. So here, I think this leaves open the possibility of a state of a greater bliss in a way, like a vijnana kind of state. But we can still accept, he's reading it as like all these worldly joys and pleasures lose their value. Okay. The other thing is, I think this is a really psychologically profound interpretation of verse 22, where he says, not even the fieriest assault of mental grief can disturb it, for mental grief comes to us from outside, is a reaction to external touches. And this is the inner, the self-existent happiness of those who no longer accept the slavery of the unstable mental reactions to external touches. I really like this because one of the biggest benefits of mindfulness practices is freedom from emotional reactivity. This is one of the big things that all of us struggle with as spiritual aspirants, right? The moment somebody says something that we don't like or something, we react, right? So how do you remove or at least diminish that emotional reactivity? This Vedantic mindfulness practice is extremely helpful. Eckhart Tolle, that's one of his main practices. You take a step back and you say, oh wait, I just got triggered. The pain body got triggered, or the lower self got triggered if you're a Vedantin. Let me identify with the higher self. That would be the Vedantic practice. And it's a kind of slavery. This is what's, so long as we identify with our emotional reactions, we're a slave to that, to those. It's basically just chemical. It's neurochemical, and there's a neurochemical basis to it, right? And we're slaves to our chemical makeup, so long as we identify with them. But if we can take a step back, that doesn't mean it disappears. We're not bothered by it. It's still there, the level of brain cramp. And then what happens is there's this kind of feedback loop where, if we consistently practice this disidentification, this breaking of identification, or this mindfulness of what's happening at the neurochemical level, the neurochemistry itself will change. And it'll make it easier for us to actually practice the mindfulness, and it'll it'll help us to diminish our identification with the body-mind complex. So there's a kind of virtuous feedback loop that goes on here as well.
I think as an experience, it almost feels like it's an externalization of an internal process that you're experiencing. So it's an actual separation. So you're literally outing the pain body and giving.
You're externalizing, yeah, right. So it's not part of you anymore.
Process.
Yeah, right, exactly. Okay, now I want to get to 23. Okay. Oh, and I didn't get to this, but it's also relevant in the context of 23. So let me get 23. Okay. Tam vidyat dukkha sanyoga viyogam yoga sannitam sanishchayena yoktavyo yogo nirvinna chetasa. Okay, I love Aurobindo's translation of this. It's very clever and funny. It's humorous. He had a wicked sense of humor, which comes out mainly from his letters, actually, and his conversations that are recorded. Okay, so let's see how he does this. Oh, he's treating this verse as also part. It's like a block of 4 verses that he treats together, so it's kind of hard to parse it. So let me just read to you. Well, I've already read to you the paragraph explaining it, but I'm going to read it to you again because I think it's funny. He says, this is page 242 of Vedanta Gita. He says, it is the putting away of the contact with pain. That's the dukkha sanyoga. Remember the word yoga means union or contact. Dukkha sanyoga, union with pain. It is the putting away of the contact with pain, the divorce of the mind's marriage with grief. Dukkha sanyoga viyogam. Viyoga means divorce, literally. Like, when you have a marriage and you dissolve it, that's a divorce. And he's saying, we're all married to depression, grief, negativity. This is our worldly plight in a way. Sri Ramakrishna will talk about it devastatingly when he gives examples, like he says, like a camel who eats this cactus, right? To get that tiny bit of juice that might be inside that cactus, he has to go through untold grief and suffering, gums bleeding, and he won't stop. He's married to pain. And it's a kind of radical delusion, right? We don't know that. And then he gives another example. He says, imagine in this lake full of fish. There are different categories of fish. One is the baddha jiva. The bound souls are like the fish who are in this net. Soon, the fisherman's going to pull up the net, kill the fish, eat it. The fish doesn't know, not only doesn't know, but doesn't recognize that it's in bondage, in captivity. And is actually very happily chomping away at that net. Enjoying himself. This marriage to grief, marriage to pain. This is the strangest paradox in worldly life, right? So, spiritual life, in a sense, is like encouraging us to divorce with our marriage to grief. It's an abusive spouse. And yet we can't get enough, and we let them abuse us. It's so sad. And instead, then this humor continues, and he says, once you divorce from grief, what do? You remarry, but whom do you remarry to? With the divine. It is the divine union, that's what he's saying. So it's very fun. So you divorce from your grief, right? It's the divorce of our marriage with grief, and we unite with the divine. That is the greatest of all gains. And then this last phrase is important. Yogaha anirvinna chetasa. We need to practice yoga anirvinna chetasa with a mind that is positive, with a positive attitude. Don't let yourself fall into depression. I've seen this a lot. In spiritual life, especially in a monastic order, what happens in a monastic order is when you first join a monastic order, 99% of people come in thinking that 6 months from now, I'm going to be in a bliss state of samadhi. Some people are lucky enough to think that they're in the state from day one. Yeah, we come in romantic, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, idealistic, and we think every monk in the order is a realized soul, and it just takes about 6 months and it'll be fine. I'll get it too. And then we come down to earth. And then the challenge comes. Because then you might start dumping on the order and saying, this is not what, they all suck. That's called scapegoating. It's a kind of externalizing of your own inner issues. There's a lot of funny things happening right now. Okay, anyway. Okay, so anyway, we all go through it. I went through it myself. And then you realize, wait a minute, monks are human beings too. And then you realize I'm also not nearly as good or advanced or as yogic or as spiritual as I thought I was. Like when you're in the world, like right before you leave the world, like I remember how like I was on cloud 9 telling all my friends, I'm out of here. I'm ready to burn my clothes and all this. And you feel superior in a certain sense because you're leaving the world behind. And so you're riding high. And then you come and you're like surrounded by people who are, many years further than you are. And you're just beginning. And then you realize, wait a minute, this is a lifelong journey. It's not even one life's journey. It's a journey of multiple lifetimes. Aneka janma samsiddhastato yati parangatim, Krishna says in chapter 6 later, actually. After the course of many, many lifetimes of spiritual practice, one finally attains the highest goal. So you have to come down to earth. When that comes, you have to not let yourself fall victim to depression, abjection, like grief, dejection, because one of the main symptoms of becoming depressed is scapegoating. It's this person's fault, or this center's fault, or this order's fault, or this, you gotta turn the mirror toward yourself. In spiritual life, that's extremely important. Yogo anirvinachita. That's why Swamiji would say, religion is not for dyspeptics. Religion is not for dyspeptics. And in our order, another thing I've seen is that, and this happened to my own kids, I'll be very honest. If you're very unhappy in a center, like I became that way after like 8, 9, 10 years in a particular center, which I will go nameless. You can figure it out pretty easily. Anyway, what did I do? I had a chat with the senior Swami in Bilumat. We had this walk, and he goes, you know what? Listen. And he's had a lot of experience. He says, when I see a sadhu getting too negative about a center, he says, I always recommend that they take a transfer to a different center before they get too negative, because otherwise they start poisoning the atmosphere of the entire center, and they poison their own minds to such an extent that they may end up leaving the order. So better to find a center that better suits you, if you think that it's really the center and not yourself, right? So there are a lot of things you have to ask. Like, first of all, am I just scapegoating the center for issues that are actually internal to me? But if you think that there are genuine problems in the center, every monk has the right to request a transfer to a different center, and you can do that. But you always have to ask yourself, are there problems? And no center is perfect. That's another thing to keep in mind. And the world isn't perfect. Now, sorry for being so, internal to monastic culture and life. But it's true of the world too. There's no situation which is ideal. Whether it's raising your kids or going to work, but there are always going to be problems. The challenge for you as a spiritual aspirant is not to let those things affect you. And it is possible that in certain circumstances, they will. Like, if something is so bad that it has a direct impact on your spiritual life and your spiritual progress, then you can say, I need to take action. And then you can take a transfer if you're a monk in a monastery, for instance, in an order, and so on. Or you can do something, you might change your friend circle. You might say, dude, like, you're being so negative, and I think it's better that we take a break. Like, that sometimes needs to happen. You have to set boundaries sometimes with people. There are a lot of different things that may in the world as well. Okay. But being negative in spiritual life is very corrosive. It's dangerous. And you get in this like downward spiral of negativity. And it's not healthy. It's not spiritually healthy for yourself or for the people around you. So you have to be on your guard. When I first joined the order, I was one of the few monks who would wake up very early, do my meditation in Bilumat at 4 a.m, and then around 5:15 I would jog, because in India it's so hot that you have to do exercise before the sun comes up. And so when I would go out for my jog, I would always see this sadhu, who's no longer with us, but he would ask me one question in Bengali. Anande acho to? You're happy, right? It was the only question. We never talked. I never even knew him, but he would just ask me that one thing. You're happy, right? Every single day I'd see you. You're happy, right? But that's really important. We might think that why should we care about whether we're happy? No, it's very important to have a positive attitude in spiritual life, because it's so hard. It's harder than anything else. It was hard for me to get a PhD. Spiritual life, purity of mind is much harder. It can be a moment-to-moment struggle, but if you have a negative attitude on top of all that, you're going to make yourself miserable. So you want to make sure that you're happy in this life and in this path and in this calling. That's really important as a spiritual aspirant. Okay, I wanted to talk about this finally, and then we can wrap it up. Going back to 621, but it's really relevant to all these verses that we're talking about. It's talking about the attainment of a higher kind of spiritual bliss, ananda. And Sri Ramakrishna would often distinguish 3 kinds of Ananda, joy. Vishaya Ananda. Vishaya means sense objects, sense pleasures. And this, I would suggest, is equivalent to what the Gita calls Rajasika Sukham from chapter 18, much later, the last chapter of the Gita, verse 38, which is Vishayendriya Sanyogad Yattad Agre Mritopamam. The same word Vishya is used. It's the happiness of sense pleasures. And it begins like, it tastes like nectar in the beginning and ultimately becomes like poison. That's the structure of all forms of instant gratification, sense pleasures. That's Vishayananda. And he says there are two other kinds of joy which are qualitatively distinct from Vishayananda. First, Bhajanananda. This is the joy of spiritual practice, of all forms of spiritual practice. Bhajana means worship of God, but I think he means it more generally. It's the joy of any kind of spiritual practice. This is equivalent to what I would suggest the Gita calls Sattvika Sukham, the Sattvika joy, described in the previous verse in chapter 18, 18.37. You can look up the verses if you want later. This has exactly the opposite structure of Vishaya Ananda, because it's like poison in the beginning. It's not always pleasant to begin with, and that's when it's really important that you not become too negative. But ultimately becomes like nectar. You once you cultivate a taste for it, it's something you can't do without. And you realize, my goodness, what was I doing all along in this level of Vishaya Ananda? Okay. And there's a very significant phrase used in 18.37 to describe Sattvika joy, Atma Buddhi Prasadajam, which means it's a joy born of the satisfaction of Atma and Buddhi, the higher self, the spiritual self, and of the Buddhi, the higher intelligence, the higher self and the Buddhi. Which means what? Sattvika Sukham, Bhajanananda, the joy of spiritual practice, it's not gratifying the body-mind complex, it's gratifying the deeper soul within us. And that's why it's qualitatively distinct from sense pleasures. It just feels different. You listen to Sattvika music, spiritual music, it does something, it hits different from worldly music. Both can be fun, both can be nice to listen to, both can give you happiness, but the kind of happiness that worldly music gives you is radically distinct from the kind of happiness that spiritual music will give you in any tradition. And then even beyond that, I think, is Brahmananda. Sri Ramakrishna calls it Brahmananda. It's the highest kind of joy. What is that the joy of? The joy of Brahman, of realizing Brahman. The ultimate reality, the divine, realization of the divine. And if you ask about the gunas and how it relates, it would be the bliss that goes beyond even sattva guna. So it's the trigunatita sukham or ananda. It's the bliss that goes beyond even that. Yeah. So that's how I see we can sort of map on Gita's teachings on these different kinds of joy onto Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. Any questions before we wrap it up? I've got to talk in 20 minutes. We good? Okay, sorry. So I didn't get to all the questions, but since we have our next class is, okay, let me give you the heads up again for people who came a little late. Our next class is Sunday, June 29th, 9:30 a.m. We'll continue to discuss verses 24 to 28 of chapter 6 of the Gita. No homework assignment. You should be happy. But I'm giving you the homework assignment for our next to next class, July 6th, Sunday, 9:30 a.m. now, so that you have 3 full weeks to do the study, to answer the study questions based on verses 29 to 32 of chapter 6 of the Gita. So the study questions are for the July 6th class. You have to submit your responses to the study questions by July 5th at 7 p.m. PST. And we have 3 classes in July, like we had 3 classes in this month, June. Sunday, July 6th at 9:30 a.m., Sunday, July 13th at 9:30 a.m., Sunday, July 27th at 9:30 a.m. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Parnamastu. And happy Father's Day.
I'm just thinking, no Swamis were named Bhajanananda, right?